Welcome to The View from 22 from The Spectator. I'm Fraser Nelson. Nicola Sturgeon has been giving evidence to the Scottish COVID inquiry. It's had the eyes of the country back on the dysfunction that's been going on inside her government, the levels of secrecy, the level of clannishness, and what we describe in this week's cover story as McMafia, a kind of gangsterism which supplanted what should have been government. Somebody who knows a lot about that is Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon's predecessor, who we feature on the cover of the magazine. He's not exactly part of her group, but certainly was a victim of it. Now, Alex, I think we've committed a cardinal offence here of putting you here in a kilt in the front cover. You never wear a kilt, do you? You're more of a tartan trews man.
I have worn a kilt. I wore a kilt at an event called Dress to Kilt. Right. So I thought under the circumstance, but that was in New York, so I can wear it away from home.
Right. But broadly speaking, was this a fair headline or was it unfair?
No, look, it's a cartoon, it's a headline, you're a magazine. What's meant to be fair about it? I mean, it's all fairs in politics and magazines. I do object to the side. I mean, I should be much, much more prominent in the picture, of course, but apart from that, I'll just treat it as a cartoon. Hamza doesn't look very happy. And after the revelations at the inquiry, he felt he had a punishment beating from Nicola as First Minister. That's probably why. Maybe that was after his punishment beating.
But the overall theme, though, that I've seen coming out of the COVID inquiry is the way that Nicola Sturgeon seems to have put secrecy right at the heart of her COVID response. There was you have her civil servants talking about how plausible deniability is my middle name. You've got other people comparing notes on how to delete WhatsApps. You've got the revelation that she deleted hers. It seems there's an awful lot of importance has been placed on how to basically dodge public scrutiny. Now, you yourself have been on the wrong side of this lot, haven't you?
Well, yes, so let's disentangle that. You're right. I mean, the Scottish Government have not emerged from the COVID inquiry with any credit, and the mass deletion, the systematic industrial deletion of WhatsApps is probably the lowest point of all. And this is, remember, what's interesting here is Nicola Sturgeon gave a specific commitment on one of the COVID briefings that everything would be retained, and that was in August 2021. And the mass deletion policy seems to have come into effect in 2022. So that is very difficult to explain in any other way, but that there was lots of stuff in the WhatsApps that they didn't want to see the light of day. The one thing I would say, this is not something unique to the Scottish Government. I mean, Boris Johnson hasn't handed over any WhatsApps. The current Prime Minister hasn't handed over any WhatsApps at all to the inquiry. So this attention to secrecy, as opposed to the attention to detail, is not confined to Edinburgh. It seems to be manifest in London as well.
But there's no mass deletion in London that we've come across. And to the contrary, we've seen every single thought that Matt Hancock had over this period.
Well, unfortunately, yes.
Right, but there is no deficits of scrutiny or knowledge of what was being said behind the scenes there. When you come to Scotland, though, you do seem to notice this is a difference. You, first of all, have got Nicola Sturgeon, as you say, saying on camera that she'd keep her WhatsApps, then going on to delete them. You also notice a difference in the civil service as well. To have civil servants talk in that way, as if they're part of a secrecy conspiracy, was quite striking. I mean, it's one thing for special advisors to say that, but civil servants?
Well, I mean, most of the civil servants who raised objections in London have been dispatched to the House of Lords or elsewhere. The current Cabinet Secretary, of course, is ill and not able to attend anything, and previous top civil servants were promptly sacked when Boris Johnson came into his administration. You know, Fraser, you're talking about things which are not particularly proper. They don't show the Scottish Government in a good light at all. It wouldn't have happened under my administration, unless you can point to the contrary. But it's not unique to the Scottish Government. I mean, the same things are manifest in London. And you say, okay, Matt Hancock held on to his WhatsApps, probably to write his book. But Kate Forbes held on to her WhatsApps. Hamza held on to some of his. And unfortunately for Nicola Sturgeon, her senior special advisor, Liz Lloyd, held on to her. So there's not, even though there was a policy for deletion, that policy doesn't seem to have been adhered to in all cases. But this difficulty, the central difficulty, I would suggest, is Nicola Sturgeon is the only person who went to a press conference, promised faithfully that everything would be retained, and then didn't.
Right. But when I'm watching all this, I am thinking back to it's 25 years ago when Devolution started. Now, I was then a young reporter in the Scottish Parliament. You were leader of the opposition.
Young MP,
and you. My point, when I look back at the idealism that a lot of people have for devolution, I was certainly one of those who's really enthusiastic about it. And I thought the following things. I thought there'd be greater scrutiny. I thought there'd be the decision-making not only would be closer to the people, but better scrutinised by the Parliament. I thought there would be a greater sense of ownership and transparency. And it seems the other way around.
Well, it's not the other way around, Fraser. It's just that
there seems to be a lot less.
In certain respects, the Scottish Parliament hasn't lived up to its own high ideals and high standards. I mean, let's not beat around the bush here. I mean, the number of people, even after the last fairly torrid couple of years of revelations about the current administration, the number of people in Scotland who don't think you're better off with a parliament as opposed to not having one is minuscule. The number of people who trust the Scottish Parliament to act in the interests of Scotland compared to Westminster is about 4-1. It's just that the Scottish Parliament is not riding as high in public esteem as it was, for example, 10 years ago. But they seem to have captured some bad habits from Westminster. Now, one of the worst things, I suspect, is this, that they wanted to claim during COVID that things were being done so much better in Scotland than they were at Westminster. And it was an easy political hit because the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson's presentation was chaotic, as has been confirmed by many WhatsApps and other revelations. So therefore, Nicola Sturgeon, whose presentation seems so ordered, composed, reassuring, and the public face of the pandemic looked much better managed in Scotland than London. The problem is twofold. One is the actual underlying policy was very similar. There wasn't that much difference in policy, just a difference in presentation. And in some ways that's not the fault of Scottish Government because you're limited in how you can diverge when the funding's coming from the Treasury. But the second thing is under the skirts of government, behind the scenes, people have seemed to have been acting with something similar in terms of their personal motivations and their personal criticism of colleagues. Now, you might just say this is the actions of people who are under great pressure. They blow their top, they get angry with colleagues, they say things on WhatsApps. But if the worst thing in politics is to pretend to be holier than thou, and then to be found out you're just as bad as the rest of them.
On the central theme of my McMaffey argument was the way that they behave in secrecy almost like a gangsters. And now you have been on the wrong side of that. I still remember the drama we had not so long ago where you published your side of the story, which was redacted, not published by the Scottish Parliament. And the Spectator went to the Court of Appeal to see if we can get a ruling whether it can be published or not. The thing is, that's quite a palaver for simply one man presenting his case. So I put it to you that my analysis is not a unionist malevolence. There is actually a transparency problem with the Scottish Government, and you yourself have been the victim of that.
Well, I mean, I said in my opening to my evidence to the inquiry that in my view that some of the institutions of Scotland, particularly the Crown Office and the Parliament, had failed the country, and certain individuals within them had failed. I don't think the idea of the Parliament failed, the idea of Scottish devolution and then a Parliament failed, but some of the people in these institutions, people like the Crown Agent, who's taking the decision about prosecution of the Spectator or opposing the Spectator magazine or a civil case against the Spectator, people who are bearing down in parliamentary committees, when in the most best ordered democracies, parliamentary committees should bear down on the institutions, regardless of who they are, without fear or favour, under total privilege, as opposed to vice versa. Now that tells me that we need to make changes to protect the institutions against having bad eggs in charge of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's too weak, isn't it? Because we saw during your case that the committee's members were told that they basically are not protected by parliamentary privilege as they are in Westminster. They were told they were told they better not ask questions about your case because if they got on the wrong side of the law, they'd be prosecuted. Now, it's unthinkable that you as an MP down here would be told that. And I put to you, this is simply a flaw in devolution, that the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the powers it needs to scrutinise the government.
I think you're right to an extent. I have to say that I would never have accepted such an instruction as an MSP, never mind an MP.
Right, but the threat could still be made, and correctly made.
So partly it's a personnel problem. I have to say, I missed this to a great extent. I reckon if you appointed the right people, you appointed the right Lord Advocate, and the right Lord Advocates, as I appointed, then the system would run properly. Unfortunately, if you appointed the wrong one, or the wrong Crown agent, things don't work. And it's particularly don't work if you get people who are anxious to please their political masters as opposed to doing their jobs. And maybe, it is an argument that as a single political party stays in office over a long period of time, then people find themselves unable to make the distinction between the party and the government. And I don't think, again, that's a Scottish issue, but I do think you're onto something when you say the institutions of government need to be strengthened, not weakened, but strengthened. The Parliament needs to be strengthened, and the separation of the prosecutorial authorities from the advice to the Cabinet and First Minister needs to be made absolutely delineated and clear. For example, I took the law officers out of the Scottish Cabinet. They only came if they were asked on a point of law. And
but
then
they're still able to attend.
No. The point is, after I left office, they were back in again under the next Lord Advocate. So, the process, I thought, well, okay, it seems to be sensible to keep these things separate, so let's do it in practice. I should have done it de jure as well as de facto.
Right, because there should be separation of the
absolutely.
law and of the government. And I put to you that was a flaw in the devolution settlement, that the powers were not separated as they should be.
Correct. I suppose if you had your time over again, there's certain things you would do and certain things you wouldn't do. And that's one of the things I would do. Having said that, we got through a fair amount in the time I was in office.
Now, when devolution came along, I thought to myself, well, this is what we need, because Scotland has got an incredible problem with ingrained poverty in Glasgow and on the Environs, with drug abuse. Train spotting had made world famous that problem. And during the next years, rather than get better, I've got a graph here of which you'll be very familiar, which is just how drugs deaths then rose significantly. You don't need me to show it to you. You'd be very familiar with this. Now, what then? So Scotland's drug deaths ended up becoming not just the highest in the UK, but the highest of anywhere in the developed world.
It's quite interesting that the sharp rise, as you can see, is towards the end of that graph. There's certain aspects of drug deaths which are historic. The people who die of drug abuse, in many cases, have been doing it for decades.
But they trebled.
But just let me finish this point, Fraser. As First Minister, looking at the array of health and social issues facing Scotland, it's true that obviously drugs was hugely important. There had been campaigns on drugs, back as long as I could remember, and they continued, and people argued, back and forward about them. To me, the prevailing difference back in 2007, 2011, it was alcohol abuse. It was, Scotland.
It's still pretty bad.
Yeah, but it has moderated in terms of the level of abuse, and we introduced minimum pricing, which was a significant and courageous move. So certain aspects of public health in Scotland have been improving. One other aspect, we can point to great successes and great failures. There's no doubt that everybody right through that graph should be thinking about the extent to which the drugs death has increased more than other countries. But for example, knife crime in Scotland, what is epidemic proportions right now in English cities, it was reduced by 75% in 3 years under the leadership of Kenny McCaskill was Justice Secretary. And incidentally, that formula that could be used in knife crime could be used in England, in my estimation, and could be reintroduced in Scotland because it slipped back.
Right, but is there an answer to a basic question, which is why drugs deaths should be so much higher in Scotland than they are anywhere else in the world?
Well, I think there's probably 3 reasons. One is that measurement. I'm not certain that many other countries measure drugs deaths as assiduously as Scotland does. That's one aspect.
Well, the rest of the UK does.
Well, I'm not even sure about that, but certainly there's a measurement issue. Secondly, the level, drug abuse is deeply linked to substantial pockets of social deprivation. Every pattern shows that. Scotland's had some sustained pockets of deprivation and therefore drug abuse in these areas. And thirdly, the policy prescription in Scotland, which has basically been to moderate the extremity of the problem through a huge methadone programme, does not, over the long period, moderate drugs deaths. It ameliorates the impact of substantial drug abuse across society, but it doesn't mitigate, as we see, the eventual deaths of people who are abusing drugs. So you need a substantial new direction. I should say, just in my defence, that the extremity of the 3 times, occurred somewhat later on.
But this isn't about you. But my point here isn't so much about even about the SNP, but it's just about the institution of devolution and the extent 25 years on. If Scots, as you say, they're very happy with Parliament, they wouldn't reverse it. But can we really say? Can we really say that the schools have improved?
Of all the explanations in all the world we might look at as to why Scotland has this extraordinary problem with drug abuse, I don't think the advent of the Scottish Parliament in 1999 is one of the causal factors.
Well, I'm wondering why it trebled. It didn't need to be that way.
Well, I think it trebled because there was a long-standing problem of abuse, which results. What you're measuring there is drug deaths. You're not measuring people who are currently drug abusers. You're measuring people who die of drug abuse. Many people die some people die very quickly, incidentally, but many people die over a long period of abuse, particularly when they've been on medication, which has ameliorated the immediate impact of the substance they're abusing. And that's just a fact. So a lot of that jump there is historic into the past. I don't have no reason why I should have the figures to hand at the present moment, but if you did an analysis of people dying now, asking when they first abusing the substances of which they eventually died, you'll find it stretches back many years, almost decades.
Can I ask you one final point here now?
But Fraser, you're putting me in a position of doing my. I think
this is not about Alex Salmond's time in office. This is about devolution in general, and whether it's disappointed you.
Nor do I want to say, look, everything went pear-shaped in the last 10 years. I might believe that, but nonetheless, I don't want to say it. The point I'm making to you is this, that I don't think over the last, that's 30, 40 years, that Scotland has got the right formula for making a real impact on the extent of drug abuse in the country. However, there are certain social and economic ills in Scotland where we did discover the right formula, and one of these was knife crime in the years from 2008 to 2015, 16.
All right. Of course, many things have got better in 25 years in Scotland. Of course they have. The question is, where can you point to the difference that devolution has made? Where can you point to these Scottish solutions for Scottish problems that have materially improved the lives of the people in Scotland? Right now, it seems, doesn't it, that we've had another channel of political entertainment. That is new. We see Holyrood, we see a rogues gallery, we see people like you stitched up by the McMafia of Nicola Sturgeon, we see a culture of secrecy, we see all sorts of problems in Holyrood. We don't really see this with Scottish parents thinking, isn't it fantastic that our schools here are so great? Instead, they're turning to private tutors in ever greater numbers. Whereas the Scottish NHS is not doing particularly well either. Even during COVID, we had a response where the proportion of people dying in care homes was far greater than it was in England. It doesn't really seem as if Home Rule has proved much of a success or a basis on which you can reasonably claim to one's independence.
Well, except, of course, in 2014 we fought an independence referendum where one of the yes, I'm not going to try to change history on you, but if you'll allow me to interrupt your question just occasionally, where one of the strongest arguments for independence in that referendum was the success of Scottish government policy across a range of issues. The Scottish governance has had a bad period over a few years, but over the peace and over the 25 years, the vast majority of people say you're far better with a parliament than without one, and there have been periods in that quarter century where the difference between Scotland and Westminster was outstanding. And incidentally, in 2014, you weren't comparing Scottish governance with a bunch of numpties at Westminster. You weren't comparing yourself with Boris Johnson. You weren't comparing yourself with Liz Truss. You're comparing yourself with what looked like a very reasonably competent administration of Cameron and Osborne. Whichever.
I don't remember you using that phrase at the time.
No, I disagreed very substantially with David Cameron and George Osborne across a range of issues. But they looked like a prime minister and they looked like a chancellor. It's a while since you've been able to say that about UK governance.
Brexit's made it harder, though, hasn't it, to make the case for independence? Because you would be saying, let's go back into the EU, look at the Northern Ireland issue. Nobody wants that on the Scottish border. That's why there's no economic case for independence anymore. There wasn't even produced.
Well, I'm just trying to work out what's actually wrong with the Windsor House Agreement, apart from the fact that Democratic Unionists don't like it for political reasons. There's certainly no economic sign that the Windsor House Agreement or being part of the single market is damaging the economy of Northern Ireland. If anything, the evidence points to the contrary. I think it would be... In fact, one of the complaints I would have about Nicola Sturgeon's administration is when offered the opportunity after 2017, when Theresa May's majority was a knife edge and she couldn't get the support of her own party for a less brutal Brexit deal, the opportunity was probably there to take Scotland into a Northern Ireland type relationship, which I think would have had great advantages for the Scottish economy. In fact, I don't think there would be many companies in the financial and other sectors who wouldn't be hot-footing it to Edinburgh at the present moment if Scotland were both part of a single market and had a preferential position within the UK market, which is approximately what Northern Ireland has at the present moment.
Right, but the support for independence has barely moved on in more than 10 years since you've had the referendum.
What you mean is that the last poll showed it at 52%, which is a very large section of the population. Fraser, if I had a poll when we started the independence campaign proper in 2012, the Edinburgh Agreement, that showed independence support at 52%, as opposed to the poll showing it at 28%, which it was then, I would have given my eye teeth for that. You've got more than half the population, despite everything you've mentioned, who think independence is a good idea. What a fantastic base from which to pursue the summit of Scottish independence.
So it's still going to happen in your lifetime, is it?
Oh yeah. Politicians can make a real muck of things. They can rough hew things how they will. But what really matters is the underlying base of support for Scottish independence. That's what's the bedrock. You'll get politicians at some point who'll organise their affairs in such a way as to take that obvious political advantage and bring it to a reality.
Right, but I remember you saying once, free by 93. That was one of your slogans?
Well, it was actually Alec Neil. And a slogan with Jim Sillars, which I didn't altogether approve of, as Alec will tell you. But nonetheless, it showed a level of ambition, of course, which I approved, not necessarily a timescale, which I thought was realistic.
All right. And can I ask, the next election, the polls are pretty grim for the SNP, suggesting they'll be down to 18 seats. That's a pretty big loss. Will this be made worse by your Alba party? Are you going to be splitting the votes and meaning fewer nationalist MPs in Westminster?
No, I think they will choose our seats carefully. We're going to intervene in about a dozen constituencies. I think it's important. The reason for an intervention, which wasn't necessary, as you know, for the last year I've been trying to persuade Hamza Yousaf of the advantages of having a single independence candidate in each constituency. Whether it be a couple of ALPA candidates or Angus Brendan McNeill and Neo Nanier in the Western Islands, there have been big advantages in doing that. But, for reasons best known to himself, Hamza didn't think that was a good idea, and now isn't actually going to stand on an independence platform. This general election is the first election since arguably 1987 where the SNP hasn't stood on an explicit independence platform.
You mean it hasn't said that a vote for the SNP is a vote for independence?
Correct. Well, they say that a vote for the SNP, if I interpret the resolution from the conference correctly, is a vote for a democratic effect. I'm not absolutely certain what that means.
So your 12 interventions, by which you mean 12 candidates.
12, and the reason for having 12 candidates is ALPA and others support the view that in the absence of a referendum route to independence, then you should do two things. One, you should treat electoral contests, the ones that are elections that are going to happen, as we did, of course, in the days before devolution, as looking for an explicit independence mandate. And secondly, the Scottish Parliament, deprived of the opportunity to hold the referendum that it should hold, it should hold the referendum with incompetence.
It hasn't been deprived of the opportunity.
Well,
It could have
okay,
a referendum anytime it wants.
Well,
They could call for one, it hasn't.
Well, they could call for one, but they couldn't actually do one.
But they haven't.
Well, I'm just making the point. There is a referendum you can hold with incompetence.
They haven't been denied it, that's all we're saying.
Well, okay, the Supreme Court ruled against the Scottish Government. Now, I would never have gone to the Supreme Court, but we are where we are. And what would I have done, Fraser, if David Cameron in 2012 hadn't said, yeah, let's go down the Section 30 route. Well, that's an agreement we can have. Then what I would have done was to hold a referendum which was within the competence of the Parliament, where you would stand a great chance of resisting a legal challenge. And that is a referendum about the powers of the Parliament, and in particular that the Parliament should have the powers to decide on independence. Now, I'm just saying now, if you combine a referendum like that with a direct appeal for a mandate in an election, then you have a very, very powerful democratic argument for Scottish independence.
So you're saying a vote for Alba will be a vote for independence.
Yes,
so people who want to express their support for Scottish independence at the next general election will be able to vote for the Alba party in the dozen seats where you can be bothered to stand.
Well, listen, Fraser, if Alba is a young political party and there's no point in pretending...
Can you not find 72... 59, sorry.
Yeah, but the resource, it's gone down a bit since you're showing your age. It's now at 57. It's like, just remember Heinz soup and you'll get the number of seats right. There's a difference, but you can't run before you can walk. I mean, Alpa's key target, obviously, is the elections in 2 years' time, where every person in Scotland will have, on the voters' roll, will have the opportunity to vote for an Alpa candidate and a direct mandate for independence. For us, the general election is a means of exploring and introducing to the people the argument we've just discussed, that you should vote directly for an independence mandate to negotiate independence from Westminster, and you should mobilise the political will to bring that into effect. I mean, the Scottish Government is lacking a lot of things at the present moment, but more than any other single factor, they're lacking the political will to bring into effect what they've been promising the Scottish people for a number of years.
I was in the Scottish Parliament, well, I was reporting in the Scottish Parliament when you made your first comeback, and I remember that quite well. This was after, I forgot, it was I think a Labour MSP had burnt down curtains in a hotel. There was some scandal. Well,
it was actually a Labour peer, by Lord Watson.
And an MSP?
No, he was... Yes, he probably was. You might be right. He was an MSP and a peer.
But my point is...
And he kept his seat in the House of Lords.
Yeah, no, but I remember you saying...
A lot of people said, of course, if he just owned up and said, look, I was trying to get rid of the Scottish political class, then no jury would have convicted.
He would have been fine. But you came back after... That was one of several sort of low-level depressing scandals that there had been. And I remember you saying that you had high hopes for devolution, and the way it's turned out was really quite low grade, it was depressing, it was beneath the dignity of the project of a Scottish Parliament, and you wanted to come back as leader to try to lift the ambitions to restore that. I'm wondering what you think now, surveying what we've seen in the COVID inquiry, surveying what we've seen in the last few years. I wonder what you think now about the devolution project versus where it could have been.
Well, I'm thoroughly in favour of the Parliament, I'm thoroughly in favour of independence. In terms of governance, I think it's time that we got some grown-ups back into the room.
If I'd have spoken to you in 2014 and said, look, First Minister, in 10 years' time, there'll be an attempt to imprison you, to remove you as a political threat, and that you're about to encounter the secrecy and the kind of the dark dealings in your party that will go on to shock Scotland. What would you have said then?
Well, I wouldn't have believed you, obviously, and you get older and wiser in these things. The one thing I'm determined to do is undo these dark forces to, well, let's use a good old North East of Scotland phrase, to muck out the buyer.
On that note, Alex Salmond, thank you very much.